Peter Simple, Chapter 1, by Frederick Marryat. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce. The great advantage of being the fool of the family. My destiny is decided, and I am consigned to a stockbroker as part of His Majesty's sea stock. Unfortunately for me, Mr. Handycock is a bear, and I get very little dinner. If I cannot narrate a life of adventurous and daring exploits, fortunately I have no heavy crimes to confess, and if I do not rise in the estimation of the reader for acts of gallantry and devotion in my country's cause, at least I may claim the merit of zealous and persevering continuance in my vocation. We are, all of us, variously gifted from above, and he who is content to walk, instead of to run, on his allotted path through life, although he may not so rapidly attain the goal, has the advantage of not being out of breath upon his arrival. As well as I can recollect and analyze my early propensities, I think that, had I been permitted to select my own profession, I should in all probability have bound myself apprentice to a tailor, for I always envied the comfortable seat which they appeared to enjoy upon the shopboard, and their elevated position, which enabled them to look down upon the constant succession of the idle or the busy, who passed in review before them in the main street of the country town, near to which I passed the first 14 years of my existence. But my father, who was a clergyman of the Church of England, and the youngest brother of a noble family, had a lucrative living, and a soul above buttons, if his son had not. It has been from time immemorial the heathenish custom to sacrifice the greatest fool of the family to the prosperity and naval superiority of the country, and, at the age of 14, I was selected as the victim. If the custom be judicious, I had no reason to complain. There was not one dissentient voice when it was proposed before all the varieties of my aunts and cousins, invited to partake of our New Year's festival. I was selected by general acclamation. Flattered by such an unanimous acknowledgment of my qualification, I felt a slight degree of military ardor, and a sort of vision of future grandeur passed before me, in the distant vista of which I perceived a coach with 4 horses and a service of plate. But as my story is not a very short one, I must not dwell too long on its commencement. I shall therefore inform the reader that my father, who lived in the north of England, did not think it right to fit me out at the country town near to which we resided, but about a fortnight after the decision which I have referred to, he forwarded me to London, on the outside of the coach, with my best suit of bottle green and 6 shirts. To prevent mistakes, I was booked in the waybill to be delivered to Mr. Thomas Handycock, No. 14, St. Clement's Lane, carriage paid. My parting with the family was very affecting. My mother cried bitterly, for, like all mothers, she liked the greatest fool, which she had presented to my father, better than all the rest. My sisters cried because my mother cried. Tom roared for a short time more loudly than all the rest, having been chastised by my father for breaking his 4th window in that week. At last I tore myself away. I had blubbered till my eyes were so red and swollen that the pupils were scarcely to be distinguished, and tears and dirt had veined my cheeks like the marble of the chimney-piece. My handkerchief was soaked through with wiping my eyes and blowing my nose before the scene was over. My brother Tom, with a kindness which did honor to his heart, exchanged his for mine, saying, with fraternal regard, "Here, Peter, take mine. It's as dry as a bone." But my father would not wait for a second handkerchief to perform its duty. He led me away through the hall, when, having shaken hands with all the men, and kissed all the maids, who stood in a row with their aprons to their eyes, I quitted the paternal roof. The coachman accompanied me to the stage. Having seen me securely wedged between two fat old women, and having put my parcel inside, he took his leave, and in a few minutes I was on my road to London. I was too much depressed to take notice of anything during my journey. When we arrived in London, they drove to the Blue Boar, in a street the name of which I have forgotten. I had never seen or heard of such an animal, and certainly it did appear very formidable. Its mouth was open, and teeth very large. The coachman threw his whip to the ostler and the reins upon the horse's back. He then dismounted, and, calling to me,
"Now, young gentleman, I's waiting,"
he put a ladder up for me to get down by. Then, turning to a porter, he said to him,
"Bill, you must take this 'ere young gemman and that 'ere parcel to this 'ere direction. Please to remember the coachman, sir."
I replied that I certainly would if he wished it, and walked off with the porter, the coachman observing as I went away,
"Well, he is a fool, that's sartin."
I arrived quite safe at St. Clement's Lane, when the porter received a shilling for his trouble from the maid who let me in, and I was shown up into a parlour, where I found myself in company with Mrs. Handycock. Mrs. Handycock was a little meagre woman who did not speak very good English, and who appeared to me to employ the major part of her time in bawling out from the top of the stairs to the servants below. I never saw her either read a book or occupy herself with needlework during the whole time I was in the house. She had a large grey parrot, and I really cannot tell which screamed the worst of the two, but she was very civil and kind to me. Before I had been there 10 minutes, she told me that she
"Adored sailors. They were the defendiers and preserviors of their kings and countries,"
and that Mr. Handycock would be home by 4 o'clock, and then we should go to dinner. As I was very anxious to see Mr. Handycock, and very anxious to have my dinner, I was not sorry to hear the clock on the stairs strike 4, when Mrs. Handycock jumped up and put her head over the banisters.
"Jemima, Jemima, it's 4 o'clock." "I hear it, ma'am,"
replied the cook, and she gave the frying pan a twist, which made the hissing and the smell come flying up into the parlour, and made me more hungry than ever. Rap, tap, tap.
"There's your master, Jemima,"
screamed the lady.
"I hear him, ma'am,"
replied the cook.
"Run down, my dear, and let Mr. Handycock in,"
said his wife.
"He'll be so surprised at seeing you open the door."
I ran down, as Mrs. Handycock desired me, and opened the street door.
"Who the devil are you?"
in a gruff voice cried Mr. Handycock, a man about 6 feet high, dressed in blue cotton net pantaloons and Hessian boots, with a black coat and waistcoat. I was a little rebuffed, I must own, but I replied that I was Mr. Simple.
"And pray, Mr. Simple, what would your grandfather say if he saw you now?" "Law, Mr. Handycock,"
said his wife from the top of the stairs,
"how can you be so cross? I told him to open the door to surprise you." "And you have surprised me,"
replied he,
"with your cursed folly."
While Mr. Handycock was rubbing his boots on the mat, I went upstairs, rather mortified, I must own, as my father had told me that Mr. Handycock was his stockbroker, and would do all he could to make me comfortable. When I returned to the parlour, Mrs. Handycock whispered to me,
"Never mind, my dear. It's only because there's something wrong on 'Change. Mr. Handycock is a bear just now."
I thought so too, but made no answer, for Mr. Handycock came upstairs.
"Are you ready for your dinner, my dear?"
said the lady, almost trembling.
"If the dinner is ready for me. I believe we usually dine at 4,
answered her husband gruffly.
"Jemima, Jemima, dish up. Do you hear, Jemima?"
"Yes, ma'am," replied the cook.
"Directly. I've thickened the butter."
And Mrs. Handycock resumed her seat, with,
"Well, Mr. Simple, and how is your grandfather, Lord Privilege?"
"He is quite well, ma'am," answered I, for the 15th time at least. But dinner put an end to the silence which followed this remark. Mr. Handicock walked downstairs, leaving his wife and me to follow at our leisure. "Pray, ma'am," inquired I, as soon as he was out of hearing, "what is the matter with Mr. Handicock, that he is so cross to you?"
"Why, my dear, it is one of the misfortunes of matrimony, that when the husband's put out, the wife is sure to have her share of it."
"Are you people coming down to dinner?" roared Mr. Handicock from below.
"Yes, my dear," replied the lady. "I thought that you were washing your hands."
We descended into the dining room, where we found that Mr. Handicock had already devoured 2 of the whitings, leaving only 1 on the dish for his wife and me.
"Would you like a little bit of whiting, my dear?" said the lady to me.
"It's not worth halving," observed the gentleman in a surly tone, taking up the fish with his own knife and fork and putting it on his plate.
"Well, I'm so glad you like them, my dear," replied the lady meekly. Then turning to me, "There's some nice roast veal coming, my dear." The veal made its appearance, and fortunately for us, Mr. Handicock could not devour it all. He took the lion's share, nevertheless, cutting off all the brown, and then shoving the dish over to his wife to help herself and me. After dinner, Mr. Handicock went down to the cellar for a bottle of wine. "Oh, dearie me!" exclaimed his wife. "He must have lost a mint of money. We had better go upstairs and leave him alone. He'll be better after a bottle of port, perhaps." I was very glad to go away, and being very tired, I went to bed without any tea, for Mrs. Handicock dared not venture to make it before her husband came upstairs. End of Peter Simple, Chapter 1, by Frederick Marryat.